Welcome to Spooky History. In today's episode, we're climbing out of our graves with the 17th century zombie apocalypse. It is said by the Penda people, now of the Democratic Republic of Congo, that once many centuries ago their ancestors saw a ship come out of the water, up from the deep, on wings that sparkled like knives. Once the ship hit land, some creatures disembarked, but the people gathered on shore could tell that the things that had come up from the depths of the ocean were not of this earth. The new arrivals were their own ancestors, now returned from the land of the dead as what the Penda people called Vumbi. This was not a joyous reunion of parent and child, for the Vumbi, who had hooves like animals, had returned to eat their descendants, spitting fire at those who resisted. Some of their victims they ate, but others they killed and took down into the hold of their ship, in which a hole was cut for sea spirits to come to. The Vumbi captain would ring a bell, and in exchange for the dead bodies, the sprites would pass up cloth, which they had woven down in the deep, and which the captain would gather and exchange for more human flesh for his infernal friends. This, as some of you may have already guessed, isn't just a story. It is the Penda people's orally passed memory of the Portuguese arrival on the coast of the Congo in the 17th century, while the story of the dead eating their own and killing them for sea spirits was recorded in the 19th century by a Christian missionary to the region. The ship rising out of the water was just what onlookers observed as it came over the horizon towards them. Because even traumatic stories about the living dead embellished over centuries still noticed evidence that the earth isn't flat. Controversial. The Congo people believed a person's skin changed to the colour of chalk when they died, so one can only imagine how terrifying the first Europeans must have looked to them. The exchange of cloth for people and then their disappearance into the ship, never to be seen again, is a reasonable conclusion based on witnessing one side of the Atlantic slave trade. The fire spitting came from muskets, and the hooves were of course just shoes. A similar observation in northern Africa would lead the French settlers there to be called the pieds noirs, or Blackfeet. Ironic, in a way, that both sides viewed the other as cannibals, physically differentiated by the colour black. Though obviously one side was given a lot more reason to fear the other than the latter was to exoticize them. Speaking of eating human flesh, you may have also noted the name Vumbi as bearing a strange resemblance to our modern word zombie, especially in the context of creatures coming back from the dead and eating the living. Depending on your interest level in the zombie genre, you may have thought, oh, that's where zombies come from then. Or, that's a strange coincidence considering zombies come from Haiti and the Vodou religion. Or, that's funny, I thought mindless undead zombies that ate people first appeared in George A. Romero's 1968 classic The Night of the Living Dead. Whichever one of these things was your thought, you were partly right, which is a polite way of saying you were partly wrong, also. Dunce. The zombie was indeed popularised by Romero, but more in the sequels than in The Night of the Living Dead itself, which doesn't use the word zombie in dialogue or in the script. Romero himself used the word ghoul, and the word zombie has been applied retroactively thanks to critics at the time and then the later films, which both copied and recontextualised it. Haitian folklore does indeed talk of the zombie either as an animated corpse raised through magic, or as an individual who has essentially had their soul removed. However, that word came to Haiti thanks to, you guessed it, the slave trade. While there is some dispute as to the exact etymology of the word, its origins in West Africa are almost universally accepted, with its ancestry being commonly traced back to Congo words. The most plausible parentage, at least to my mind, is the aforementioned Vumbi, which as we said means revenant or corpse that still has a soul or has lost the soul. But other suggested etymologies have it derived from the Congo word for god, Nzambi, or fetish, Zumbi. By fetish I mean an inanimate object, to which mystical qualities are attributed, and not the reason you have those items hidden at the back of your bedroom closet. In fact, the Vodou religion as a whole, which the zombie is often erroneously associated with, was a combination of the traditional religions of West Africa and Christianity, which was encouraged by the plantations. It was thought that the Vodou deity Baron Samedi would gather the displaced dead from their graves to take them back to the heavenly afterlife in Africa, at least if they pleased him. If they had offended him in some way, they would be a slave after death forever as a zombie. Of course, slavery and colonialism were traumatic experiences for both the individuals and cultures involved, particularly in the Belgian Congo, where the unsupervised rule of Leopold II, who personally owned the entire country entirely by himself, would rank near the top of any list of horrors inflicted by one people on another. We try not to dwell too much on real human pain on this channel, so we'll avoid describing how these white creatures from another world killed 8 to 10 million people, half of the population of the Congo at the time, in less than 3 decades. The zombie, as he exists today, is traditionally seen as the result of, like most things, a slow evolution. So it's very interesting to find it here, almost in its final form, perhaps coincidentally, in the private kingdom King Leopold made for himself. Looking dead but coming back to life? Check. Eating human flesh? Check. Leaving behind deserted wastelands populated by marauding gangs of cruel warlords masquerading as law and order? Check, check, check. Hell, even the idea of zombies using tools can be found here and in Haiti centuries before Romero's Day of the Dead. The idea that white men were supernatural was something that early explorers definitely encouraged. Using knowledge of an eclipse to appear to control the sun may be a cliche now, but there's a reason for that. Explorers and soldiers in the Congo region are recorded as keeping a collection of electric batteries in their coat to give the locals they shook hands with a shock that nearly knocked them off their feet, using a magnifying glass to light a cigarette, or getting a chief to fire an unloaded gun at them before seemingly producing the bullet from their shoe. Nor was this superstition entirely restricted to Africa. King Leopold II, the man who in one of the worst displays of capitalism history has ever seen, personally owned the Congo entirely himself. He had such a bad reputation for his personal and business practices that, after visiting his relative Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Kaiser's puritanical wife ordered an exorcism of the palace rooms he had stayed in. Wilhelm himself once called him Satan and Mammon in one person. Despite owning it, Leopold never visited the Congo or directly saw the consequences of his actions, but prolonged contact with the Europeans he and others employed will have taught the locals that they weren't really undead creatures who controlled the sun, had superhuman strength, or were immune to bullets. Though it won't have been much comfort to many of them. After all, a ravaged country is still a ravaged country, a cut-off limb is still a cut-off limb, and losing the people around you is still that. There is a very particular horror in any story based in truth, but this one I find particularly striking. It is a story many of us will not know, one which simultaneously records the impressions of whatever long-forgotten person just happened to be standing on a beach when that first Portuguese sail appeared over the horizon, and of the deep wound that was created by the horrendous violence inflicted by those incomprehensible creatures from another world. These colonial zombies didn't cry out for brains, but for escarvos, ivoire, and caoutchouc. But, like the book said, there truly is nothing new under the sun. The Night of the Living Dead and the Bela Lugosi film White Zombie may or may not have made the zombie into a Western cannibal creature representing societal fears, but if they did so more by ascribing themselves into a tradition than by entirely taking it over. The Vumbi, of course, existed before the Europeans, but their arrival in high numbers and heralding what must have felt to many like an apocalypse must have been a pretty marking example of the legend, to say the least. These bodies from the land of the dead came in large numbers, as they do in our own horror stories, but these ones came with malice, a language, and tools. These ones didn't just kill, but also took and enslaved. These ones didn't just wander around fields waiting for the sound of their next victim, these ones reigned over them, often for centuries. In the words of Makunzo Kyoko, a 20th century oral historian of the Pende people, our fathers were living comfortably. They had cattle and crops. They had salt marshes and banana trees. Suddenly they saw a big boat rising out of the great ocean. This boat had wings all of white, sparkling like knives. White men came out of the water and spoke which no one understood. Our ancestors took fright. They said that these were Vumbi, spirits returned from the dead. They pushed them back into the ocean with volleys of arrows, but the Vumbi spat fire with a noise of thunder. Many men were killed. Our ancestors fled. The chiefs and wise men said that these Vumbi were the former possessors of the land. From that time to our days now, the whites have brought us nothing but wars and miseries. 11 years after the White Zombie, cinemas tried to attract audiences with a film which combined the current monster with a retelling of Jane Eyre. The film was provocatively titled I Walked with a Zombie. Little did these audiences know, they may also have been related to one. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Spooky History. You can find us on most social media at Spooky His Show, and you can support us with donations at paypal.me/noisyghostend. If you have suggestions for future episodes, leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching, and please remember, Black lives always matter.